Hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining us at the Competitive Advantage Talks presented by Kager, also known as Craft Analytics Group. My name is Patrick Sherry, and I'm an MBA student here at MIT Sloan. It is my pleasure to introduce the presentation, Modeling Injury Risk in Sports, Data, People, and Impact, presented by Sarah Bailey. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Sarah Bailey, Director of Football Research and Development for the Tennessee Titans, to the stage.
Is this the Is that the slide? Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah. Like you said, I'm the Director of Research and Development for the Tennessee Titans. And today I'm going to talk about modeling injury risk in sports, specifically focused on the data, the people, and the impact it can have on the organization. This is definitely not a very technical talk, so be warned, but hopefully by the end of it, you can come up with some of the pieces that you need to really properly build and deliver a model that can be used in practice. So the first thing I want to talk about is just a very important distinction between injury risk and predicting injuries. This does not aim to predict injuries. I find that that's hard to do, and it's very difficult to say like this singular injury at this place at this time is going to occur. Whereas when you look at risk, you can talk about different things that might impact it, and you can actually be actionable on that. So what is it? Well, obviously it does include injuries, and there are multiple types. You can have soft tissue, you can have bone injury, breaks, you can have joints, you can look at cuts and scrapes. You can also have different locations where you have upper body, lower body. These are all things everyone knows in your head, but how do you choose those things? And I know in football, there are some things that are just inevitable. You get hit hard, you're gonna get hurt at certain cases. So how do we look at injuries that maybe we can impact and we can affect? Maybe we remove the bone breaks. Maybe we remove some of the cuts and scrapes. Maybe we only look at lower because that's gonna cost us more time out. Maybe we look at shoulders and above body for different positions like the quarterback. Why do we look at injury risk? I think the big thing is obviously the team impact. When you think about injuries, you can think about a competitive advantage from a team perspective where you have your starters that are going to play, you want everyone to be ready, but you also have your broad depth of players where you have your next up that might need to come in at any point. So it's important not to differentiate between your starters and your backup roster. You really need to focus on an injury for every single person. The other thing is just a player impact, and that doesn't necessarily just mean the player's ability to perform, but it's the mental impact that goes into injuries and how a player responds post-injury, as well as the response of their body afterwards. How does it affect their speed? How does it affect their ability to accelerate? So by reducing these types of risks, you really optimize the player themselves. And finally, from a bottom line type of thing, injuries are expensive. Last year alone, there were over $400 million in cash only in the NFL in injuries. That's about $13.2 million per team. That doesn't include any of the cap hits. That doesn't include some of the external costs that you don't think about, and some of the costs of roster management and changes that you have to make if an injury occurs. The other thing is just an investment in players. I think a lot of times people talk about sports with winning and getting the Super Bowls and being able to be the best team in the NFL or the NBA or the NHL, but there's ultimately one thing that drives that, and that's your players. And if you're not investing in them, you shouldn't expect them to invest in you. Another thing that I want to talk about is the who of the organization. And I think this is important and often overlooked as an analyst when you're walking into an organization that says, hey, I want you to build an analytics model, or you just build one. If you build the best one available and you don't have the people invested, it's not going to be used and it's not going to be worthwhile. So the first really comes from the top up, from the front office, where you're looking at your general managers, your presidents, being invested in you as an analyst modeling it, but also in the technology that you might need to be able to efficiently track and measure your players. The other is your personnel. You need to look at your scouts that are bringing in the guys from college that have done all this research on who the player is, what their injury history is, how they've responded to injuries in the past, maybe what they've done, their workload cumulative, what they've been able to handle, as well as new players coming in where they have a past history and they also have past information that your scouts can find out for you. The final is player engagement. I think most people leave this one out as well, but if you have a player that gets injured, you want to be able to make sure that they have the right support outside of the building to be able to do the things that they need. Furthermore, if there are things that are affecting them, that are increasing their risk of injury, you want to be able to have those people in place that can help them get better sleep or manage their stress if there's something external happening. The most obvious one is the medical, your trainers, your doctors, your dietitians. And this isn't just in the sense of they have to be on board, but oftentimes they're going to be doing a lot of the testing and the protocols and the tracking of the data because they're heavily involved with the players. So if they're not involved, then there's nothing to be used. Also, once you've built the model and there's an alarm or a flag going off, your trainers need to build the protocol to be able to help lower that risk. With dietitians, you might look at different weight boundaries in different areas that might affect a player. Can you lower your fat percentage while also increasing mass? Can you keep a body fat down and not lower your power and your strength? And where's that optimal range? The other one is coaches. Coaches, this is both on-field and your strength and performance coaches. Your on-field coaches have to be invested. If you have a good relationship with them, then you can bring them this information and tell them about load management and keeping players, whether it be for a practice or a few reps or managing it during the game, and be able to actually buy in and they'll listen to you to really optimize the likelihood that your model is successful and that it gets to the desired outcome of no injury. The other thing is strength coaches, and they'll come up later with the type of testing that you can do to measure different components of an athlete, but a lot of that comes with them where you're looking at asymmetries in strength or different mechanisms that they can use in the weight room to help really analyze a player and also keep track of their progress over time. And finally, the players, and I kind of hinted on the other side, I think players need to be just as invested in their outcome as you are as a team. And I really think one of the best ways to do this is by teaching them the why. A lot of players coming out now are well-informed. They've always been well-informed, but there's more knowledge about their bodies, about their risks that they're taking to be on your team. And giving them a why behind the things that you're doing and the things that you're requiring of them is going to help more buy-in, it's going to get better data, and it's really going to help the whole organization. Next, we're going to talk about some of the data sources, and this is just a handful of them, but it kind of touches on some of the depth of data as well as how much there is. The first is some things that we've probably all heard about if you've paid attention to tracking data is the tracking data. So you have game data, you have practice data, and with that you have coordinates so you can track changes of directions, you can track speed, you can track accels, you can do just a simple load management program. And you have that for both practice, so you know how much you've gone into the game as well as the game once you've accumulated it. The second is the weight room data, and there's so much data in the weight room that is really undervalued, and there's also some that is over-tested and overvalued. One of the things that you can look at is with your lifting, and this is why the performance coaches are so important. They have different technologies that can measure power and velocity out of various types of lifts, squats, bench press, single leg squat, all these different things that you can look at a player's depth and their velocity out of it at certain weights and be able to track their fatigue or their strength or, again, asymmetries. But also they have different technologies too where you have a camera, and now you can start looking at angles and see how straight your knee is when you're squatting to be able to look to see if your form is correct, and is that an indication of a change that needs to be made, or is there a fatigue that's occurring? The other is some type of speed analysis, and that can be using the tracking data, but there are other technologies as well where you can hook a guy up into a speed machine and be able to analyze their actual form in the first 10 yards and be able to look at their type of push-off and acceleration. That can also come from the strength coaches as well, where they're experts in their position, so they can look at a player and have indicators as to what they're doing and be able to include that in your analysis. One that's a little controversial is the self-evaluation. In the NFL, we are not allowed to track anything outside of the building, so there's a lot of information that we miss when a player leaves. How well did you sleep? What is your hydration? Are you stressed? Are you sore? Those are all things that are inherently hard to track while staying in the confines of the rules of the NFL. So one thing that you can do is do a player survey where you can ask them how they feel. Well, important to note about this is just understanding each player's boundary is going to be different. So where I might feel sore and I will put a 3 when I'm sore, another player might always put a 3, and when they're very sore, they might put a 5 on a scale of 1 to 5. And finally, of course, the greatest predictor of injury future is injury past. And that's the big driver there, is the injury history of a player. And how do you track that, and how much detail can you get about the mechanism of the injury, the type of injury, the location, and the recovery needed. Final thing, the third step is scheduling. So now that you have all this information about the type of tests that you can do, how do we schedule it? There are various different things that you need to consider. One is, what kind of tests are you going to do? Are you going to jump on a force plate and do a counter movement jump? Are you going to do a single leg lunge on it, a push-up? What type of things are you measuring, and why are you measuring them? And I think that depends a lot on your goal of the question, but also the position that you're looking at. Also want to think about when, what day of the week. If you're measuring things on a Monday in football after a Sunday game, you're likely measuring a more fatigue indicator. Whereas if you wait until Wednesday, you're probably looking more at a readiness factor. And keeping those in mind as an analyst will also help your project, because if you understand where the data is coming from, you understand the variables and the interactions, then you're able to gain more insight into the results. Finally, how often? Big thing that people struggle with as players is they have so much of their life planned. If you continue to test them constantly and frequently, there's going to be test fatigue. So really being very picky with what you choose and how often you're doing it. There's an idea that you want to maintain a level of consistency with maybe certain tests are every week, but you also have to keep in mind that there might be some we only need every quarter, or maybe there's tests that really aren't impacting, and as an analyst you can recommend that we just don't need to do that anymore. The other thing is time of year. I always say with the NFL we need 3 types of injury models. The first is during the season, where the ultimate goal is performance on Sunday and being ready for the game. The other is in the off season, where you're looking at building your strength. You're not doing as many on-field drills, so you have to build a different model for that. Your calendar looks different, your schedule looks different, your workload looks different. And finally, training camp. Training camp is where a lot of injuries occur. So how do we get guys coming in where we don't know a lot about what they did for the summer? How do we onload them properly and also track them to be able to kind of see when a guy is going into a red zone? Final thing you want to look at is, with your scheduling, is what is your goal of the model? Are you looking at injury like this aims to discuss, or are you looking at a performance metric? Are you looking to see how well a guy is doing? Are you bringing a guy in for a workout to be able to compare them to current NFL players? Are you looking at a readiness for game day to see if a player is ready to go? Are you looking at a strength deficiency? Maybe that's an off-season metric where you're trying to analyze a player's strength and target any inefficiencies that they might have. Now we can finally get to some of the model building, where we're looking at these things that you need to consider. With anything in a model, you need to look at what your outcome is. Do you want to look at games missed? Are you looking at practices missed? Is there a soreness? Maybe you are valuing those player wellness surveys as the end all, and that's going to be your indicator. Maybe you're doing unsupervised learning where you're not necessarily looking for an outcome, but you're looking for abnormalities in the data. Other thing you want to look at is the output. Is it a percentage, an expected value, another type of data source? I think the output is very important from an interpretation standpoint, where as analysts we might understand an abstract number. We have to be able to communicate it to the people that are actually going to implement the changes. Big thing that is very challenging is sample size. With most injury models, your best injury is going to be an individual player one, where you're able to look at each player as their own set of data. And this is important because your workload is going to be different than my workload, which is going to be different than another position's workload. So that oftentimes leads to a very low sample size, particularly when you deal with a small schedule like we have and players coming and going, as well as not really knowing a lot about new players that come in. There is a benefit if you get a new player from a pro team. You might be able to ask for their old data if the other team did it, but players coming in from college, you have very limited information on what they've done in the past. Another thing that you can look at with rookies is, how do you get an onboarding period with those new players and those rookies to be able to determine that you have enough information now to feel confident in an individualized approach? And what is the approach beforehand? Typically one might choose position, one might group by body size, one might group by skill group, and be able to kind of apply a general model until you're able to say, okay, we have enough, now we can go into a player specific. The last thing that you want to think about is the evaluating the model performance. What is going to be your outcome? How are you going to determine that this model is working and accurate? That can be a very challenging thing. Hypothetically, if your model is working and everyone's following exactly as you say, there shouldn't be many injuries, and it's very hard to actually justify that. Also injuries, albeit they seem to occur more often, they are quite zero inflated when you look at it from a broad perspective. So how do you consider that in your analysis and really see what is significant and what is an increased marker? That brings to the final point, which is the practical application. And I think that this is something that most people jump in, they build this model, and then it's like, now what? And that's why when you work with all those people beforehand, you can come up with those cues and those indicators where, hey, this guy has an asymmetry in his left hamstring. So now you're working with your medical staff to maybe work on that hamstring, and maybe you're working with your strength coach to strengthen it, and really getting them in a protocol that will help change that, and seeing the change also affect the risk score. Another thing you want to look at is the interpretable output. This is something that people from a general manager to a coach to a nutritionist to the engagement to a trainer to the strength coaches all need to be able to read and to understand. So how do you output something that makes sense to everyone? Part of that is through communication and being able to talk to them about what the output means, but if it's too convoluted and it's too confusing, you're probably going to lose a lot of people. The third is just having reasonable expectations. You can give all the advice you want and understand that you cannot always tell a player to sit out. That is sometimes not an option. So being able to be reasonable with how you expect this model to come out and what the actual course of action is going to be is something that's going to help not only you, but the organization to know that there's flexibility and leniency in the actual results. There's other things that kind of help with that is there's thresholds for severity. A lot of things that I'll do kind of go in stages to where you have a yellow or green, amber, red kind of stoplight type of light where if you're at red, this might be a more, hey, we have to look at this now. If you're in the amber stage, maybe there's some subtle things that you can do. And again, most of the things, I'm not a professional in working with players to increase their strength and mobility, so I trust that up to the experts, but being able to figure out what pieces are contributing to the model to bring it to the right people is going to really help build the right success that you need from the results. The last thing I'll talk about is just instant communication. I think that's been an emphasis, is communication with injuries is huge, but really what it needs to be is it needs to be immediate. Once you get all the data in, you need to be able to communicate it to the people that are going to be coordinating for the week. So if you are finishing your testing on Monday, that needs to be sent out Monday night so that the coaches can plan the week. If it's Wednesday morning is when everything's done, you have to have immediate alerts. If a player needs to sit out, they need to be able to alert that and plan their practice around it to plug and play other positions. And if a player needs to be on the medical bed during different types of meetings, they have to know that. So being able to find a way to do that, whether it's through email or text message or alerts, working with like your technology department to determine that is something that's also going to help save a lot of time and help save you from having to run around and telling the different people. Just open it up to questions.
Thank you. This was a great talk. Thank you very much. My question is around how do you make the decision to adopt a new technology or metric? So let's say, I don't know, someone pitches you a method to detect how much lactic acid they have in the muscles or something let's say novel, and you're trying to decide if you're going to implement it or not. And I guess a reason I'm asking this question is we had two Patriots players at a different MIT conference this week who were kind of sharing some of their frustrations around sometimes feeling I think they use the word guinea pig, when it's you're making them do all these tests and sometimes they don't really know what it's for, how what you're gonna judge them based on. So I guess a two-part question of how do you communicate this to the athletes, and also how do you judge when something is robust enough and useful enough for you to actually implement it, if it's let's say on a weekly basis or a monthly basis.
Yeah, I think testing fatigue is real in the NFL, and what that often leads to is bad testing, which is bad data, which doesn't help you anyways, so it's something you want to avoid at all costs. When I'm looking at new metrics and stuff, I am a researcher at heart, so I start with the research, looking at papers, looking at other sports that have maybe implemented it, people that have lab experience or are able to do those types of experiments to be able to justify something. I think Once you build that, there's also certain things that you can do that aren't just going to help with an injury data, they're also going to help understand a performance level or a strength level or a speed. So metrics and tests that you can use across multi-departments and multi-areas are ones that I'll emphasize as well. Ultimately, once you've decided that this has viable, logical research behind it, and you communicate that to the players, that's when you can start testing. And again, maybe it's an infrequent testing, maybe it's once a week, maybe it's once a month. Once you get enough data, you can really start to look at it from your own player's perspective. And I think it's important to be humble and be able to go back and say, hey, this actually did not work for us, and cut it out of the system so you're not doing things just to say you did.
Thanks for the rundown. That was great stuff. Just, do you have any advice on how to store all of this data, consolidate all this data, and pull it together? Because that sounds like a whole lot of different systems and processes and places to land things.
Yeah, it is a lot of data, and I think the big thing is a lot of these things are from different technologies, so you do have to figure out a central warehouse to be able to store it. It's something that I think evolves and changes constantly. In terms of recommendations, I am not a data engineer, so keep that all in mind. You can look at a data warehouse, look at big data systems, a lot of these companies have APIs that you can work directly with if you don't have the resources to store on-prem, or you can just start up a simple SQL server.
In your first answer, you mentioned also looking at external research to inform some of your interventions, but it sounds like you create your own models as well. How frequently are your interventions coming from something you identified with internal models, and how often are you looking at external stuff?
I think the external stuff is really to look at the research that's being done, and everything does have to be applied in-house. I think there are certain thresholds that maybe have worked with soccer or with a different sport that wouldn't apply to the NFL. So a lot of the times, if we have the data and I see something interesting, we can duplicate the process and see if we find similar results. I really use it for, I guess, more inspiration than anything. So a lot of it are internally driven.
Thank you for the talk. That was great. Just curious, with all the different metrics, the different departments that you mentioned on these slides earlier, how long was that data discovery process, and how did you go about scoping it before getting to modeling?
A lot. I will say I have started almost 2 years ago with the Titans, and we're still refining a lot of the pieces and the technology. You go through a lot of changes in that time. You go through coaching changes, and now your entire practice schedule changes. So you have to almost start over again and try and repurpose and reuse the pieces that you can. I think it takes a full season to understand patterns. I think it takes more than a season to be into a really predictable type of mode.
Thank you for your great talk. You talked about several type of data, such as tracking or weight rooms. So is there any priority in terms of precision or volumes of data?
Yeah, I think the big one that we all use is tracking data is probably the number one, just from a pure workload perspective. You get to see how much mileage a player has run, what their acceleration, their high speeds are, which really impacts wear and tear on a body over time, especially in football. In terms of the other ones, it's really working with your strength coaches too. Again, I trust people with the domain expertise to bring also their knowledge, and it's having that collaborative effort that makes things more efficient. I think, people like a good force plate. They like a good hamstring tester, things like that have kind of had a proven ability to show an injury risk.
Question?
Sorry. You mentioned the difference between risk and prediction. Which one is more valuable to your stakeholders, and which one do you find yourself focusing on more in your work?
I focus primarily on risk. I think injuries themselves, like I said, they're extremely hard to predict an exact injury, an exact location, and an exact time. I think looking at risks helps you identify flags and things that may increase or decrease that from a general holistic ability. Regardless of the type of injury, you're still going to miss time. So that's kind of how I view it in a way. Now, obviously, as you like fine tune and you get more information and data, being able to differentiate between upper body and lower body is important. But I still think like having it be perceived as a risk more than an actual injury is going to get more buy-in as well. If you go to your coaches and you say, hey, he's going to get an injury on September 10th, 2027, they're going to look at you and say, okay, what do I do with that? So if you come with more of like, hey, his risk is elevated, maybe we need to monitor his load today.
Thank you.
Awesome. And thank you so much, Sarah. That'll conclude our talk for today.
Thank you.